Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you a great method of painting Supreme Grand Master Azrael of the Dark Angels for Warhammer 40,000 by Games Workshop. And because it's such a major character and indeed the actual chapter master of the Dark Angels, what we thought we'd do here is go a little bit further. So this video is going to be a bit more advanced than we normally do for painting a Space Marine and indeed a Dark Angel. So if you're looking to push yourself, this is going to be a really interesting video for you. We hope you enjoy it and we'll see you at the desk. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video what we're going to do is paint this character in a slightly more advanced way than we normally do so, and this means we need to just think a little bit more about sub-assemblies as we're putting the model together to make it easy to access all these various features as we do these different techniques on them. So for that reason I've got a fair few assemblies just here, and you can see the main body of Azrael has been assembled, but I've kept the backpack and head separate, and for the backpack in particular it's to allow us to access the robes on his back easier, but also it's to make it easier to paint that back banner. As for the head, well, on Primaris Marines what you tend to get is a very high colour, so the helmet is going to be obscured a little bit by that. If you decide to build your Azrael without the helmet on, then I'd recommend doing the exact same thing, and in fact when it comes to painting the skin, we do have a video in the technique section all about painting the flesh, so just paint it just like that. In addition, the Watcher has been kept separate as well, but I did make sure that it would fit on the full assembly for the base that he's actually standing on before gluing all these different sub-assemblies separately. So this way we know when the final assembly comes round, he will fit on the base with Azrael. But with that done, what I then did is undercoat everything with standard grey from Colourforge, which is a good starting point for all the colours we're going to be using, and then what we can do is get going. And what we're going to do is start out by just laying in the three major colours that appear in this miniature, which are Burgundy robes, there's bone-coloured robes, and that dark green armour. So what we're going to do is just roughly block those in, make sure they're nice and neat, and then we're going to paint them in detail one at a time. And once that's done, we can then move on to the finer details scattered all across the miniature. So I'm going to start out with the green here, and for this the colour I've picked out is some Wyvern Green, though from Citadel you'd want to go for Caliban Green. The choice really is yours, but with this what we want to do is just start out by base coating all the green features, which is mostly the armour, and bear in mind on the back banner there is that image of that sort of shape of death that appears on there, and that's green as well, so be sure to get that. What we need to do is just roughly base coat these features, so what I've got here is an old medium base brush from Citadel. It's quite a frayed brush, but for the sort of thing we're doing here it's ideal because it means it's going to be nice and quick. And so as ever, what we need to do is just make sure we thin the paint down with a little bit of water, just being careful not to overdo it. And with that prepared then, it's time to start painting all of the details that are green. And all we've got to do is just roughly base coat them at this stage, just making sure we get this colour in all the nooks and crannies. Once you've got that green on those various pieces, the next thing we need to do is base coat those other two colours I mentioned. So we've got the sort of cream coloured robes here, and then we've got a little bit of burgundy as well. So we'll start with that cream colour. For this what I'm going to use is some Dragon Fang, and then for the burgundy I'm going to go for some Royal Cloak. But we'll start out with the Dragon Fang because it's a larger area, so we can just apply it fairly roughly and then again neaten up as we get to that burgundy colour. So for this I've actually switched to a slightly more control brush now. I've got a size 1 here from Ardsopus, sort of a medium sized brush really. And with it what I'm going to start out doing is base coating around the areas that are close to the green for that control. So for example on the main body assembly, what we're looking at here is going to be these sorts of parts around here where it goes up and over that green armour. But where you get to more open parts that are easier to access, you might want to switch back to that rough brush, so for example down here. And bear in mind this is going to be all the robes, including the ones that are on the Watcher, so just be sure to get those at this stage as well. Once that's done, we can then move on to the burgundy, and on the robes this is going to be the lowest level, so we're looking at this part down here that we want to base coat entirely, and also on the power sword be sure to get the grip. One other thing to base coat at this stage is actually on the Watcher, and that's the cover of the book that's at his waist, so don't forget to get that little detail as well. And with that, we've now got those three main colours all blocked in, and at this stage just take a minute to look around to make sure all three of them are nice and neat. And once that's done, what we can then do is start working on them one at a time to really bring them up to some nice highlights. And I've thought about this for the order we want to do it in. What we need to do is start out with the burgundy, and that's because these robes are on the inside of the other robes. So basically it's going to be very difficult to do the lighter robes first, then come back to these, because inevitably as we're doing the technique here, we're going to catch the robes that are on top of it. So we need to start there. So for that reason, we'll start out with that burgundy on the inside, then moving outwards outwards from that we've got the green armour, and then we're going to do that cream coloured fabric that goes over the top of the green armour. So what we'll do is start out with that burgundy, and here what we're going to do is some wet blending. Now if you've never done wet blending before, you might be under the impression it's quite difficult, because it's certainly got the reputation for being that, but actually it's way easier than you might think. In fact, it's exactly how Bob Ross used to paint skies, and it really is just a matter of just getting the colour on there and mixing it whilst it's still wet on the miniature itself, and play around with it until you're happy with it. So what we need are two colours to do this, and we'll start out by using that royal cloak once again, but now we're going to introduce some sword hilt burgundy into it. And what we need to do is start out by having both those ready on the palette, and you can see I've got them down here, so here we go. I've gone down to a size 0 brush here from Arts Opus for a little bit more control, though any sort of medium-sized brush will do, preferably one with a good point on it. And what we want to do is just make sure we've got a little patch of thin down paint of both of these ready. So do the same with that burgundy just there, so there we go. A little bit too wet on that one, so I'll just bring a bit more pigment into it, so there we go. I want it to be nice and smooth. And with that prepared, what we then need to do is start applying it onto these areas. So I'm going to start out with the darker of the two colours, so the royal cloak, the one that we got on there already, and what we want to do is paint this into the areas that are going to be darker. So that's going to be the creases. So for example, we're looking on the inside just here. So what we want to do is just apply it into that region right there, and then into this region right there. Then, whilst it's still wet, just grab the other colour, so some Sword Hilt Burgundy, and we're going to apply this onto the raised up area. So we want to go all the way down there to get that stronger colour, just building it up with a little bit more of it. So just bringing it down there like that. And then what we're going to do is just go into that recess where the darker colour is and just go back and forth, drawing the paint down into it. And this way the two of them mix and we get a nice gradient between the two. So you see it's nice and quick to do, and in fact this is a great one to practice it on because it's a very small area and the two colours work very nicely together. But remember, it's just a matter of making sure that you apply the lighter colour onto the raised up area, so once again just here, and then go back and forth drawing it into the darker one so you get that smooth gradient between the two of them. With that blend built up, you can see now we've got that really lovely transition from the darker colour to the lighter colour. And also, if you take a look at the book, I just laid it on top of the cover of it just there. So just the flatter area just to make that stand out. And if we take a look at the grip of the sword too, you can see I picked out the top of those ridges on the grip. So a little bit of highlighting there, but now we're starting to really bring the colour out by adding that lighter tone on there. And now what we need to do is take it further. Now to do this, what we're going to use is Sword Hilt Burgundy once again, but now introduce some Vampire Fang to it. So we're going to mix a sort of pinky colour here to be the highlight. So what we need to do first of all is get that ready. Now I've gone down to a smaller brush now. I've actually got a size 00 here from Arts Opus for lots of fine control because here it's going to be quite delicate. What we want to do is create this pinkish sort of colour, so we're looking for a tone a little bit like that. It doesn't have to be exactly this sort of thing, but something like this. You can always just bring in a bit more if you want to during the course of applying it. Well, what we need to do with this is again just wet blend this onto the robes first of all now, because we're on smaller areas now we have to be quite selective about it. So you don't need loads of the Sword Hilt Burgundy, but with it we just need to apply it onto the top of each crease in the area where we were, well, applying this previously. So a little bit more focused towards the very top of it, this sort of area just here, just apply it thinly into that region right there. Then quickly grab your mix of the lighter colour, and this we're just going to start applying on the very peak of the fabric. So this way it's going to blend into what we've got, and we can just gradually build it up, and this way we again get that nice smooth gradient as we get lighter and higher up on the fabric. With that done, the burgundy parts are now highlighted, and so we can now move on to the next those major colours, which remember is going to be the green armour. And for this we're going to go through a similar sort of sequence of blending on there, but it's a little bit different because of the nature of it being a different sort of surface, because now we're looking at armour in most cases. But again, it's going to be all the green we've got here, so remember that Angel of Death that appears on the banner. We need to highlight that in the same way at the same time. But what we need to do here is begin by adding some shading into the green, because right now we've got the mid-tone of that Dark Angel's green style armour. We just want to introduce some shading into it towards the underside of details and the bottom of our panels. So to do this, what we'll need is that Wyvern Green once again, but now we also need a pitch black. So here I'm using some Doom Death Black. Now again on the palette you can see I've got both paints set up and ready. I'm using my size 0 brush for this one. I just want to make sure we get them thinned down a little bit, so just a little bit of that green just there, and then the same with the black. And what we need to do with this is pick one panel at a time and just start blending it all together on that panel. So what we'll do is start out with the shoulder plate, and we need to begin by getting some of this green. So let's get a little bit of this loaded up, and we'll use the shoulder that we've got just up here as the example right here. Now first of all, don't worry about minor details that appear on it, such as a scroll, because we can come back to that later on. Instead, what we're aiming to do is to make this green darker on the underside of the shoulder plate. So I'm just going to begin by painting some of this green quickly onto that area. Then we're just going to grab some of that black and start applying it. Now this is going to be quite stark at first, but as we go back and forth you can see it mixes into that green. So I'm just going to add some there to build it up. Get a little bit more black and then apply that as well. Again, just going back and forth, drawing it up onto that green, because this way, you can see what I'm creating is that gradient. So it starts dark on the underside just there. In fact, it's pitch black right in the deepest corner, but it goes a little bit lighter to that normal dark green around about there. Now, once that first coat's dry, you might find it looks a little bit stark in some of the transitions just there, but it's okay. Just let it dry, then do a second coat over the top. So we'll let that one continue to dry and do the same on this bit of the armor just here. So again, some of that green onto the part where it's going to be blended, so it's dark. Oh, we've got that nice bit of wet paint around there to work with. Then we grab the black, and this is then just going to be applied into this part first of all, then pulled up into that green right there. So we get that gradient happening on that area like that. Now you can see this is about dry now, so what we can do is now just start to fine tune it. If you look around here, there's a little bit of a sharper line just there. So what I'm going to do is start by just addressing that with a little bit of Wyvern Green, just gently applied there like that, just pulling it down into that black. And then we can grab a little bit of the black and start playing around with that on the underside right there. So just introduce that a bit more. Again, pulling it up into the green, and if we're finding it's a bit sharp at this point, we can grab some of the green and go back again. You see, it's just a matter of playing back and forth like this, and this way you can control it quite easily and get that smooth gradient on each panel. Now, this is going to be one of the longest stages of doing this because we want to try and get it as smooth as possible, and we do want to do this on every green panel. So just take your time working around the miniature, looking for each of these, just creating that gradient as you go along. I've now finished doing that subtle blending across all the green, and it is subtle because we are of course working with dark green, but you can see it is starting to give some depth to these areas, and so now what we can do is push that a bit further with some even darker shading. Again, what we need is some Doom Death Black, but this time instead of blending it into things, what we're going to do is thin it down and paint it directly into all the recessed lines on the miniature for that green detail. So to do this, what you'll need is a really small brush. I'm using my size 00 now, so a really small one with a good fine point on it. What we need to do is just thin the Doom Death Black down on the palette so it's quite inky. So bringing it down to about this sort of point here. See, it's a little bit runny, but it's still quite a strong colour, so that's ideal for what we want, because with this we're now looking for all those corners. So for example, if we take a look at the body piece just here, if we go around the chest area, what we want to do is to run it directly into areas such as these little recesses we've got on this little sort of thing on the front of the face just there, on the front of the the collar, also inside here, going around that design on the chest into all those little recesses there. And as we've got the panels down here, we want to run it directly into the corners here as well. So this is going to be our darkest shading, and it will give a bit more definition on the shape of the armour. And with that, we've now got that shading completed, including on the flag design just there. And so now we can move on to highlighting this green. And for this, what we're going to be doing is edge highlighting, but taking it much further than we normally do. And to do this, what we need to do then is start building up that highlight so we get a nice gradient building up to that sharpest colour on the very sharpest edges. So it means the first thing we need to do is return to some Wyvern Green, but now we're going to mix it with some Emerald Green to get a sort of in-between tone here to start to work towards that highlight. Now to do this, I'm going to be using my size 00 brush here, and you can see I've got the two colours next to each other on the palette. What I want to do is create a roughly 50-50 mix of the two. So we're looking for something around about that just there, but I'm also going to make sure I've got plenty of Wyvern Green ready, just in case we need to blend this back together as we apply it, because with this, we're looking for an edge highlight, but a fairly broad one, a bit more than we normally would do for a first edge highlight, because this is going to be a soft one that's going to start building into the further highlights. So if you take a look at the shoulder plate around here, what that means is applying it onto areas like this and just bringing it a little bit onto the flat. So about 0.5 millimetre or so is about the sort of length we're looking for here. So fairly strongly in there like that, but as we get round to the darker areas, it just needs to become more precise. So if we take a look at the forearm just here, so we can see it going over the top here, it means on this side, towards the top, we want to go quite broad. And as we follow it round to this area here, we want to get narrower and narrower until it's really sharp as we go into the dark area around there. Same on the front just here. Again, it's darker underneath, so we want to be very sharp on that bit. And as we get around the top where the green becomes stronger, we're going to make it go wider. Now, in the very strongest areas where the green is, well, the brightest almost, what we want to do is make it a little bit thicker than that even. So bring it a little distance onto the flat of the panel. And this is where having regular Wyvern Green is useful, because what we can do is, whilst it's still wet, just apply a little bit of Wyvern just past it. And this way we can blend the two of them together. So we get that nice smooth gradient on these large areas on the top. Same will be true on top of the shoulder plate just here, where we're actually going to introduce it a little bit onto this flat part here to make the green lighter here, and then again just grab that Wyvern Green and just blend that into it beneath it just there. So we get it lighter at the top, getting darker as we go underneath. That first highlight's applied, and you can see it is subtle because the green is still dark, but we are starting to get some highlights appearing on there, and so now we can take it further. So what we're going to do is another edge highlight. This time we're just using emerald green on its own. Then after that we'll move on to ethereal green to really make it start to pop. But first of all, what we need is that first green, so it's going to be some emerald green here, again applied using that size 00 brush, and with this it's just going to be a pure edge highlight all the way around. So trying to keep it nice and focused, nice and narrow as you go along, so as neat as possible. So remember, the trick to doing this is to make sure it's all right on the palette. So it's quite thin there already, so I'm happy with that. I'm just going to make sure I don't have loads of it on the brush so it doesn't run out of control. And then what we need to do is just start working our way around the miniature, looking for all the sharp edges on the green and following along each one. Now where possible, I'll be using the side of the brush to skim along areas like this edge just here to make sure we get that sharp green highlight catching along there, but oftentimes it'll have to be the tip of the brush instead, such as on the inside of this shoulder pad trim, where we're just looking to be as neat as possible, just gently following it all the way around to start to build up that nice highlight. And once that's done, we can then move on to ethereal green, and with this what we're looking for is a fine edge highlight. So this is actually going to be all the way around on every edge, but what we want to do is make these lines as fine as possible, because if they're too thick it can be a little bit overwhelming. So you can see I'm just really taking my time, making sure I'm angling the miniature to make sure I can apply it in these neat strokes like this, in this downward motion, so I get that very fine line, because we just want this to be a very sharp green just to really help this pop out. And with that sharp highlight applied, you can see the detail is now nice and clear, even on the image on the banner. And well, what we can now do is move on to one final highlight just to really finish this off. And what we want is once again some ethereal green, but what we're going to do to make it brighter is mix in a little bit of elven flesh. So what we need to do is mix the two of them together. You can see I've got them both here next to each other on the palette, and using that small brush once again, the size 00, just going to bring them together to make a bright colour, this sort of tone just here. That's what we're looking for there. And then with this, all we want is a very small amount of it on the brush, so hardly anything really, and we're now just looking for the very sharpest corners on the armour, just the bits we want it to, really pop out that little bit more. So for example, if we look at the body just here, it's going to be areas such as the corner of this shoulder plate right here, and all we're going to do is just skim it just that bit there like that, just to get that brightest little bit of green just there to finish that off. And with that done, the green of the power armour is now complete, and so is the green part of that flag. And so now what we're going to do is move on to the third of those major colours, which is the cream colour on those robes. And for this, what we're going to do first of all is introduce a little bit of shading. Now before you start doing this, just make sure it's all nice and neat with Dragon Fang. And then what you're going to need to do is get Dragon Fang and also mix into it a deeper brown. So in this case, I'm going to use some Mornfang brown. Now I need to be careful not to overdo this because we only want a subtle bit of shading here. So I'm only going to go for a small amount. I'm using a size 0 brush for this. I'm just going to get some of this onto the palette, mix them together to get that darker tone. You can see what I mean, it's very strong straight away, and we don't want it to be anywhere near that powerful. So really make sure that it's more this kind of tone here, so you're only slightly darker than Dragon Fang on its own. And once you've got that prepared, what we need to do is start blending this into the deeper parts of the fabric, so the creases and that sort of thing. So what we need to do is just make sure it's nicely thinned down, and at the same time, just make sure we've got some regular Dragon Fang available to use as well. So just get a little bit of that, make sure that's thinned as well. And there we go, we're then ready to go. So we'll start with the darker colour, and here with this we're looking for those creases where it goes inwards. So if we take a look at the front here, that means areas like this. And all we want to do is just introduce some of this into that deepest area, just a subtle amount there like that, and then whilst it's still wet, grab that Dragon Fang and just wet blend on either side. So just add it on here and then bring it into that darker colour so the two colours mix, and giving us that smooth gradient of colour. And with that, you can see now we've got the shading appearing there in the fabric, and it's not gone too far, so it's not going too dark, and we're keeping that cream colour for it, but we're definitely getting some definition there. And so now what we can do is start to go the other way by adding in some highlighting, and for this what we're going to do is again lean on some Dragon Fang, but we're going to introduce some Skeleton Legion to it, because again it's going to be some wet blending for this. Now as before, what we need to do is have both ready on the palette, and I've got the two of them just here, so I've got some Dragon Fang here and some Skeleton Legion, using the size 0 brush for this one, and as usual what we want to do is just prepare both of these by just thinning each down so we've got some paint to draw from so we can jump between them as we need to. So there we go, that's both of them thinned down. And so what we want to do now is start looking towards the raised up areas of the fabric. So to do this, I'm going to start out with Summon Dragon's Fang, and all I'm going to do is load up with some of this and then pick a crease to begin with. We'll start out with this one just here, and we want to apply it away from those recesses that we went into. So we're looking at this sort of region around here, and then it's time to grab our highlight, so some Skeleton Legion, apply that and just let it mix into those colours whilst they're still wet as we go along. So this way we build up that smooth gradient once again, get that nice highlight on the raised up area. With that highlight applied, you can see now we're getting much more volume on the fabric here, and so now we can take it even further by moving into our final highlights for it. And for this, what we want first of all is some Vampire Fang, and then once that's done, we'll move on to Trooper White to finish it off. But first of all, we need some Vampire Fang, and with this and some parts, I'm going to be doing a little bit of wet blending. So I've still got some of that Skeleton Legion on hand to help out with that. So we'll start out with that sort of area. You can see I've got some of the Vampire Fang here. I'll just get it thinned down as ever. And we've still got some of that Skeleton Legion available next to it that we can use if we want to, because you can see there's a bit of a jump between the two of them, and we want to make sure it's still got that smooth gradient happening there. So with this, what we're going to do is first of all take a look at the cloak, or it goes around the hem just here. What we want to do is follow it all the way around in areas like this, using the side of the brush, just skimming along, but not going quite into the deepest recess where the colour is darkest. So when we get to about there, we'll just stop, then carry on again just around here, picking up that highlight so it continues around there. But just do that all the way around. Now when we get to this top bit, this is where the little bit of wet blending is going to be necessary. So what I'm going to do is just make sure this is nicely thinned and just apply a small amount into this region around about here, just very gently skimming it on there like that. And quickly, we'll grab some of the Skeleton Legion and just use it to blend it on the sides. So just a little bit there, a little bit there. So you don't need very much, but we just want that slightly lighter colour appearing just along the top here. What we're going to do is just keep working at it just to make sure it blends in with the surroundings. So there we go. Now a bit further up as we get here, the creases start to become more defined. So in this case with the Vampire Fang, what we want to do is pick them out in the sharpest areas. So that's going to be around the front in areas such as just here, just following it around parts like this. But you can see these creases just here that have been, well, showing through. We're looking for the sharpest part of these, and we just want to pick these out as well. And once that's done, we can then finish off these robes with a very fine highlight of Trooper White. And with this, we're just looking for the most extreme parts that are standing out the most, such as just here, and it's just a very small amount of this colour on these corners just to help them pop. And once that's done, the cream-coloured robes are now complete both on Azrael and also the Watcher. And, well, with that done, what we've now finished doing is painting the major three colours that appear on the miniature. But there are a whole host of smaller details that we now need to start doing, and so we're going to begin by doing the black features here. And for this, we're going to start out with an off-black that we can shade down. So I'm going to use some Death Reaper for this. And to apply it, I'm going to start out with a size 0 brush, but it's a good idea to have a smaller one on hand because some of these parts are really small. Now there are some particular parts that we need to pick out in black on the armour. So for example, on the main body of Azrael, we've got things like his little tilting shield right here, which we want to make sure we paint black at this stage. But also bear in mind there are going to be other black features on the miniature, such as the joints in the armour, like this one right up here. But on the Watcher, if he's holding the sword scabbard, all that needs to be painted black as well at this point. With that off-black applied to those details, the next thing to do is to shade them, and here rather than using a wash, what again we're going to do is use a darker colour and run it directly into the recesses. So for this what I'm going to use is some Doom Death Black, and to apply it I'm going down to a size 00 brush now, because the application here is very much going to be like what we did on that green armour earlier on, when we were running this into all the deepest corners to get that shading on those parts. So just make sure you thin this down so it's nice and inky, so round down to about this sort of point here, and then we can start looking for these parts. And I'll do this on the banner because we've got some good creases on here, and you can see at this stage I've painted the main body of it black on both sides just there, and so what I'm looking for now are creases such as just along here, and what we want to do is just carefully run this colour into the deepest area. So areas such as along here, for example, also we've got one right here and just here, so always these deepest parts to get that little bit of shading. And there we are, we've got the shading in there, and it is of course subtle because it is, well, black on near black, but it is important to get it there to get that depth in those details. And now what we can do is exaggerate it by moving on to the highlighting, and for this what we'll need are 2 greys, starting out with some Dungeon Stone grey, so a nice dark grey, and then we'll need a light grey, so here I'm going to use some Carcharodon grey. But we'll start out with Dungeon Stone grey, and to apply it go down to that small brush once again, so I'm using the size 00 for this, and here we want to pick out the sharpest edges and also the creases of these details. So on things like the joints of the armour, you're looking at the ridges. On these more armoured parts, like that tilting plate that's on his shoulder, you want to go around the edge of it. In the case of the banner, what we're looking at is the outer edge of it first of all, so we want to go along areas like this using the side of the brush, just skimming along to get that grey line going all the way around the outside. But in addition, we've got the creases to pick out too, such as these ones across the top of this pole just here. We want to look for the raised peak of it and just gently follow along. Once you're happy with that highlight, we can then move on to a fine highlight using some Carcharodon grey. And this is just to help these sharpest parts pop out a little bit more. So we're looking at things such as the corners on the edge of this banner, just down here, just a little bit, just to make that edge stand out. Also, what we want to do is highlight areas where the light's going to be catching. So we're looking at these creases on the top just here. Again, we're just looking for the sharpest areas. Just gently go along each one. And with that, the black is completed, and so now we're going to move on to the next phase, which is going to involve base coating and shading and highlighting a whole host of colours that can all essentially share the same shading at the same time, which is why we're bundling them all together. These details are quite small and they're scattered all over the place across all the assemblies, in particular the first one, which is going to be red. So at this stage, definitely make sure you've got some reference images because they'll be useful just to refer to as you're doing this part. But what we need to do is base coat that red, and for this what I'm going to use is some corn red. And to apply it, I'm going to start out with my size 0 brush, but have some smaller ones on hand because you will need them, because these parts are all shapes and sizes, and as I say, they are scattered all across the various assemblies of the miniature. But throughout though, it's just a matter of, as ever, just making sure that paint's nicely thinned down, then to start looking for these features one at a time. And it's going to be things like the wings that appear on the helmet. There's also various little details on the banner. I'm going to start on the main assembly of Azrael though, because the casing of his gun is this colour, so we just want to paint that in at this stage. And here we have the model with all that red detail base coated, and you can see on the banner what I mean about lots of small details, so be sure to get all of those. I've even picked out the fire that appears on that banner image at this stage. But with that done, what we can now do is base coat 2 more colours. We want to start out with a darker silver, so I'm going to use some Surcoat silver for this, and then we'll need a brown for the leather. In this case, I'm going to use some Thondia brown. But first of all, we need Surcoat silver, and to start out with, again, I'm going for my size 0 brush, but feel free to change as and when you need to throughout this, because again, these silver details appear on all the various assemblies of the miniature, and they're all sorts of shapes and sizes. So just use your picture reference to guide you through here. But really it's a matter of just looking for these parts and blocking them in. So for example, on the gun down here. Now one part I'm going to very deliberately leave out at this stage is going to be the blade of his sword up there, because we're going to come back to that later on. So don't worry about that. Just get everything else that's silver at this stage. And with all that silver now base coated, we can move on to the leather, and for this I'm using some Thondia brown. And this is going to be details such as this pistol holster just here, but be aware there's also a rope around the waist of the watcher, so be sure to paint that in this colour at this stage too. And with that, we've now finished applying those colours that can all share the same colour wash, and now it's time to apply that wash. In this case, it's going to be a black wash. So I'm going to use some Oblivion black wash for this, and to apply it, again, change brush as you need to, because these details are all shapes and sizes, and we just want to keep us focused on these new colours that we've added in since the black. So we're looking at the red, the silver, and also that brown. So I'm going to start out with a size 0 brush to apply this, but I'm definitely going to go for a smaller one for the finer details. But this is great when we're looking at things like his gun, where we can actually paint it over the whole thing. So what we want to do is introduce it to this feature and then wash it all the way over so it stains all of it and darkens it down and gives us that shading. But whenever you get close to parts we've done so far, such as his hand right here, just really take your time moving that wash up to it, but not onto it, so that you don't splash it onto those parts that we've painted so far. With that black wash now dry, we can move on to cleaning up the red before we move into highlighting these colours. And so what we need to do now is return to corn red to do a little bit of layering on all the red features. And for this, I'm going to go for a really small brush, down to that size 00 here for lots of control, because the idea here now is going to reapply this colour to these red parts, but avoid the recesses throughout. And these parts are all quite intricate, so we'll need that small brush for the control as we do this. So all you got to do is make sure you've got that paint ready on your palette, just making sure you don't overload your brush with this colour, and then it's ready to well, it's time to start applying it. What we're looking for is areas such as on the gun just here where we want to avoid the corners, so we're looking at flat areas such as just along here, making sure the colour's nice and bright and clean on those parts, but you can see I'm just being careful not to let the brush fall into the recesses. So for example on these vents around the front of the gun here, I'm just aiming for these flat parts and just using the side of the brush to skim across them, so this way I just get the raised area going around those vents, but the brush doesn't fall into the recess. With that red cleaned up, we can now move on to highlighting it, and for this there are two main phases of applying it, starting out with just a pure highlight, but then on that back banner where there's some fire, what we need to do is just apply it thinly to that to start to brighten it up and make it look hotter. So for this we're going to use some Evilson Scarlet, and to apply it I'm going to be using that really small brush once again. Back to that size 00 for lots of control with this, and we'll start out with that highlight. What we need to do is just make sure the paint's nicely thinned down, so it's nice and smooth, and then much like when we were highlighting that green armour earlier on, we're looking for an edge highlight here, as sharply applied as possible. So for example on the gun down here, we're looking for all the corners and edges, and where possible I'm going to approach using the side of the brush just to gently skim across these areas, such as along here, to get that sharp highlight, same just here on the eye inside, but sometimes it's a matter of using the tip of the brush instead to get that fine line, such as on these little panel lines a bit close to the front just here. Now when it comes to that back banner, we have also that fire as I mentioned on there, and for this what we need to do is just make sure the paint's thinned down a little bit more so it's nice and thin, kind of like this really. And once you've got that prepared on the banner, what we need to do is just look to the flame towards the bottom of it, and it's quite small areas but they're around this angel of death almost around here, and we just want to thinly apply it onto these parts, making sure that the red gets just a bit stronger the further up we go. So just gently apply it so that it's about this sort of strength and just apply it throughout. Once you've finished applying that highlight, we can then take it further by moving into an orange to really help finish this detail off. And for this, what I'm going to use is some orange flare, again applied using the size 00 brush, and with this we're now looking at it as a fine edge highlight. So remember that mix we made with the green earlier on when we just then selectively applied it to the sharpest areas? It's a very similar sort of thing for that. So to do it, remember, make sure the paint's nicely thinned down, and with orange you won't need to add much water to it because this colour tends to be quite thin anyway, so we just want to make sure it's nicely smooth there like that, so we've got that translucency about it so it fades into the colour beneath it and gives it that smooth gradient. And with that prepared then, we can start looking for these areas, and so we're looking for the sharpest corners, such as on his gun just here. That means areas such as this corner at the front here, just gently skimmed on to steadily build up that orange, and there we go. So you get that nice bright highlight on the edge to help finish these corners off and help them pop out. Now in addition, we've got that fire once again on the banner, and for that what we want to do is similar to the previous stage, again applying it thinly, only this time more selectively towards the bottom of the fire where it's going to be hotter. So once you've got that paint thinned and ready, just like before, so it's nice and translucent, we can just start building it up in the right area, which is going to be down here towards that angel's leg, just down here. And what we want to do is just thinly apply it into this region to give the impression of the fire being hotter down here. And with that, the red detail is now complete, and so what we can do is highlight those other new colours that we introduced, starting out with the leather. And for this, what we're going to do first of all is highlight with a mix, and for this I'm going to use some Thondia Brown once again, and I'm going to introduce some Wasteland Brown into it. Now once that's done, we can then move on to Wasteland Brown on its own for a finer highlight, and then we can move back to that silver. And to do this we need a bright silver. I'm going to use some Mithril Blade here. But first of all, what we need to do is create that mix, so we're looking for some Thondia Brown and also some Wasteland Brown. And for this, what we're aiming to do is to get a roughly 50-50 mix of the two colours. So if we start with a little bit of Wasteland Brown there on the palette, don't need loads of this because there's not a massive amount of leather to do here. But what we want to do is just get some of that Thondia, which is a stronger, darker colour, so just make sure you don't overdo it as you mix these together. Just bring the two colours together in the middle there, like that. So looking for this sort of tone just here, and with that prepared, what we need to do is, as ever, just thin it down with that little bit of water. And then on the leather details, we're looking for the sharper edges and textures that we want to pick out. So if we take a look at the pouches and the holster that we've got around here, it means that what we need to do is start edging along it. So first of all, we just want to follow it as if it's an edge highlight, so all the way around areas such as along here, just very carefully. Then what we can do is make a second pass, but this time purposely just be a little bit heavier and just dot the brush on it. And this way what you do is start to build up a bit of a texture to it, so it's appearing to be older leather that's starting to crack a little bit. You can even, if you want to, just introduce a few lines going onto the flat part of it, again to suggest that texture of it, but just keep it as a smaller thing, a subtle detail, so it's something that you see when you look closely at it but doesn't overwhelm it. So just small areas there like that. Once that highlight's been applied, you're then ready to move on to some Wasteland Brown for a finer highlight, and here we just want to do that slightly rough application right from the very start, just gently dotting this on a little bit to help boost that texture ever so slightly, so just little bits there like that. And where you add those cracks into the flat parts of it, just go along those ever so slightly as well to make them a little bit brighter. And now that's done, we can move on to highlighting the silver, and for this we need some Mithril Blade, and this is going to be an edge highlight throughout. So remember, just take your time, approaching gently with the side of the brush where you can, just skimming along to get that sharp, bright silver line on the edge to get the nice highlight. But when you can't quite access it like that, just remember to angle the model so that you're comfortable and approach the tip of the brush and just gently follow along that edge. And with that, the silver is complete as well, and so it's time to move on to the other metallic, because what we need to do now is some gold. And for this, what we want to do is get a really rich, warm-looking gold. And so to do it, we'll start out with a base coat of some dragon's gold, and then wash over that with some flesh wash for a nice bit of chestnut-coloured shading. But first of all, what we've got to do is base coat it with dragon's gold, and to start out with, I'm going for the size 0 brush once again, but as ever, feel free to change as and when you need to, because these details are all shapes and sizes, and they're on every part of the assemblies as well. So we do need to change as you go through this. The whole process, though, is just to make sure that paint is nicely thinned down and just not overloading your brush there, using the palette as you need to for that. Then it's time to start looking for the golden details and blocking them in. So for example, the crossguard and the sword, just want to get a nice neat finish to it, so just take your time, especially when you're getting close to features that we've already finished so far. Once you finish base coating all that gold, it's then time to apply the wash over the top of it, and for this I'm using some flesh wash to give it a really nice warmth, and it's just a matter of very carefully applying it over the top, making sure that it doesn't run onto any other colours. Once that wash is dry, we can then move on to really brightening this gold back up again, because the wash has had a bit of a matting effect on it. So what we need to do now is return to some dragon's gold and this time layer it on. So very much similar to what we did with the red earlier on, to make it a bit brighter and a bit cleaner. Now this time to apply it, I'm going for the size 00 brush, because a lot of this is very fine, so I want that control as I do this. So a small brush is ideal for that sort of thing, and we just need to make sure the paint is nice and smooth, just thin down so we don't have too much on the brush. So just remove the excess there by just twisting the bristles along, and then we can start reapplying this onto the gold areas. And now we're looking to avoid those deeper recesses. So for example, on the crossguard of the sword here, where we've got this skull, that means we want to concentrate on areas like the forehead just here, but then skip past that recess right above the eye sockets, and actually get to the face. Just use the side of the brush and skim along it there like that to pick it out. Same as this little bit just here, we want to get that flat part and avoid the recess as it arcs in, and carry on just there. Same on these wings, we're looking for these flat details such as just here, just very carefully picked out. Then as you get down these wings just here, just be very careful just to keep to the raised up part and just avoid the bristles falling into the recesses. Once that's done, you'll see that we've returned that shine to all that gold detail. So now what we can do is move on to highlighting it. And for this, we're going to go for 2 highlights, starting out with some glistening gold, so a nice bright gold here. Then we'll move into a platinum using some Canoptech alloy for a sharp highlight to finish it off. But first of all, what we need is glistening gold, and for this you definitely want to go for a small brush, so I'm back to the size 00 here, and what we want to do is to edge highlight all this gold detail. So the same sort of thing as when we were highlighting the armour, just that throughout. It's all a matter then of making sure the paint's nicely thinned down so it flows really well from your brush, so you've got that accuracy as you apply it, and then just make sure it's not overloaded with too much paint. Then you're ready to start looking around for all those gold details once more. And now we're looking for those sharp corners, so remember, where possible, approach the side of the brush and just gently skim across these areas, just turning the model as you need to so you're nice and comfortable. But remember, if you can't quite fit the brush in that way, just revert to using the tip of it. Just make sure again that you're comfortable and look for those edges and gently follow along each one. And with that done, we can then move on to Canoptech alloy, and this is just going to be a fine edge highlight. So we're just looking for those sharpest corners and just want to focus a little bit of this colour on those parts just to help them pop out that bit more. And there we are, that gold detail is now all completed, so we can move on to the next set of features, which are going to be various features that can all again share a same colour wash. In this case, it's going to be a brown wash, and what we're looking at here is going to be the parchment, the purity seals, that sort of thing. So we're going to start out with some ivory tusk, which is going to be for that parchment, and then once that's done, move on to some sandstone, and this is going to be for a feather that appears on the tilting plate. Finally, what we need is a burgundy colour for the purity seal wax, and in this case, we're going to use some sword hilt burgundy. But first of all, what we need is that ivory tusk, and this is quite a light colour when it comes to parchment. Normally we go for more like a yellowy bony kind of colour, but in the case of this colour scheme, we've got all those robes that are that sort of colour anyway, so we need something different so that the two of them don't clash. You want to have some nice contrast so you can see the parchment against all of it, so that's why we're going quite pale on this. What we need to do first of all then is to base coat all these features, and for this I'm using my size 0 brush once again, and for this first step all we need to do is just be as neat as possible blocking this in. So it's a matter of looking around all the various assemblies for any bits of parchment that you can find and essentially colour them in. So for example, this one on the waist just here, you can see why it needs to be so bright contrast against those robes. So we want to make sure we get all of this. But bear in mind there's also going to be some more decorative parts like this. So on the back of his shoulder plate, for example, there's one up here that we need to paint in this colour. And bear in mind on the back banner there are also details like this too, including some bone details on the skeleton there. So be sure to get those as well. With that done, we can now move on to some sandstone, and this is going to be to base coat the feather, and it's just hidden around here. Again, just take your time as you're blocking it in to make sure you don't catch any of the surrounding details. And then finally, we're back to some sword hilt burgundy, and this is to pick out all the wax of the purity seals. Now that we've got all those details blocked in, it's time to apply the wash over those. And in this case, we need that dark brown wash. So what I'm going to use is some Battle Mud wash for this, applied using the size 0 brush to begin with, but you definitely want the small one on hand, especially when you're doing that back banner with all the bones and things that are on there. You'll need fine control around that point, because we just want to keep this wash just on these new colours that we've introduced. So for example, if we take a look at the tilting plate up here, what we want to do is just wash it over the parchment and that feather. So just smoothly applied, and it is going to make quite a stark difference, but what we want to do is just make sure it doesn't build up too much in any one area, so just keep it moving until you get to around about this strength, and then just leave it to dry. The wash is now completely drying, and you can see it's toned those colours down quite a bit. So now what we're going to do is just do a little bit of layering on the parchment before we move on to highlighting these features. And so what we need to do now is return to Ivory Tusk, and this time I'm going to apply it using that size 00 brush for lots of control. And also we want to get some translucency about it here, so be sure to thin it down your palette to make sure it's quite thin. You want to see some of that paper showing through it here, so we want to get it right down to around about this sort of point here, and then with this we want to fairly selectively start applying this onto that parchment so that we keep the shading in the recess parts, which are quite shallow, so basically we're exaggerating the effect of them just here. So if we take a look at this one that's on the front right here, what we want to do is just start applying some lines going in this sort of direction across it, just making sure it's nice and thin, just gently applying it like this so we get some of that white showing to it, but also we keep that colour given to us by the wash. So just very gently going like this all the way along. Same on this side down here, where again we want to do the same thing to build that up steadily. Now when it comes to this feather, we can also use this colour on this a little bit, and in this case we just want to carefully go in and just pick out that central spine of it, so very gently just skim down with the centre of the brush there like that. Then we just want to go around the outside of it, so all the way around here, on there, same on this side, again just gently applying the brush to that feature just to get that highlight going along there. And then the trick is to start getting the impression of some texture on here whilst leaving it darker towards the base of it, so towards that tip. So from about this point on here, angle yourself like this and just skim a few little lines that are quite spaced out at this point, but as you get further up, just start bringing them closer and closer together. And this way we get the impression of that texture, but also it becomes lighter around the base here, stays darker around there.
What about the skulls?
And with that layering done, you can see those details are now much cleaner, and I just want to quickly point out, I've also done it on those skulls that appear there on the backpack. You can see I've just layered that, making sure to avoid the recesses so that those are nice and clean as well. And with that done, what we can now do is move on to highlighting all these details. Now I'll start out with that parchment and also those bone features, and for this we're going to use Trooper White. And then for the wax parts, the purity seals, what we need is some glistening gums. Finally, we're going to add some text onto the parchment, and to do this what we need is a very dark brown, so here I'm going to use some cuirass leather. But first of all, what we need is Trooper White, and to apply it, definitely go for your small brush. So I'm back to the size 00 here because we're just looking to highlight these features now. So we're just looking for the sharpest details, trying to pick those areas out. So when it comes to the parchment, that means that first of all, we want to go around the outer edge of it. So if we take a look at these parts up here once again, that means gently approaching with the side of the brush, so about 45 degrees in the flat, and just very gently skimming along that edge there like that to get that nice highlight running all the way around. And then we just want to pick out some of the creases here and just give the impression of a bit more texture on there. So just do 1 or 2 lines just going across it, such as areas like this. Now in addition, remember there is that skull to do on the backpack, well the 2 skulls that are on there, and for this just look for the parts that stand out, and again just follow along each one. Exactly the same thing as what we're doing really here in the parchment, just looking for features that stand out and essentially exaggerating them. Once that's done, we can then move on to glistening gums, and this is going to be to highlight the wax of these seals. So what we want to do is just dot it around the outer edge just to pick out some of that texture, and then just do a few little bits in the middle as well to pick out the little skulls that are marked in there. So just very gently there like that. And then finally, we just need a little bit of cuirass leather to add some text to the parchment. And for this, just make sure you thin it down with a little bit of water and go for your finest brush. So in this case, I'm using the size 00. And all we need to do is just use the tip of the brush just to almost dot on a few squiggles to give the impression of text going along them. And just work your way up to get that impression of it going up along there. Now also, if you want to, on this shoulder pad, you can write Azrael on here. Now this is freehanding if you want to do it. The best way to do something like this is to start out with the central two letters. So in this case, that's going to be an R and an A. So the middle's around about there, so we want to go a little bit to the side of it with the A. So it's just going to be a matter of applying some straight lines just very gently in there to create that A. So there we go. And then we need to do the R on the other side. The R is a little bit more tricky because there is the rounded part to it, so instead just start with the straight part. So that's going to be a line down there like that, and then we want to have the little leg of it coming out just there, and then we can use that as reference to essentially fill it in with the rounded part just there like that. Now you can see this text is very, very fine, but what I'm doing here is just laying in the initial pattern for it. So once it's on there, you can always go back to previous colours to adjust it as you need to, but with these two middle letters laid in, we can now use them as a reference point and start working our way along either side, and this way the word is going to be evenly separated across that scroll. And with that, all of that parchment is complete, along with all the purity seals and that feather too, and we've also got that writing on the paper. In fact, if you take a look at the shoulder plate just there, you can see we've got Azrael's name written on it. And so now what we can do is move on to the next detail, which is going to be some more white here, though again off-white. Instead, what we're now looking for is the more decorative white elements, so angel wings, that sort of thing. And in this case, it's more of a sort of greyish, kind of almost pearl sort of white. And so for this, what we're going to do is start out with Corax white for the base coat. Now to apply it, again, I'm going for my size 0 brush, but as usual, change brush as you need to, because some of this even appears on the banner, in particular on that wing of that Angel of Death that's on there, and you will need a fine brush for doing that to pick that out. But the process is always the same. Just make sure that paint's thinned down so it's under control, being especially careful with this paint because it can get quite thick and gloopy, so you do need to test it on the palette and make sure it's smooth. I'm going to bring it down to about this sort of point here, and once you've done so, it's just time to start looking around for these features. Now these are another one of these elements that are scattered all across the miniature in all the various assemblies, so again just use your pictorial reference to guide you through here, but generally what you're looking for is the angelic imagery, so things like the wings that we got just here, and always keep an eye out for dark angel symbols too, such as this one that we've got on the shoulder pauldron right here. With that base coat applied, the next thing we need to do on these details is put some shading on there. And what we want to do here is create our own shade that's not going to be too dark or too overwhelming, but is sort of bluish grey in tone. So for this reason, I'm going to use some dark Reaper. I'm going to dilute it using some Lamia medium to give it those properties of paint more like a wash. Now this really is going to be for the more wing designs, things like on the chest plate where there's a lot of texture and recesses that we need to get into. But there are some quite simple things, such as on the forearms. You don't need to worry about those because they're quite flat and quite simple designs. And we'll just highlight them later on to clean them up. But what we need to do is create this effectively a wash that we're making here, and to do it we're just going to get a little bit of dark Reaper. Now I'm using my size 00 brush for this because I really don't want to overdo this, because it's very easy now to let this run out of control. You just need to keep it focused on these areas, so definitely make sure you use a brush like this to, well, essentially prevent you from putting too much paint on at once really. And what we're aiming to do is to create quite a dilute version of it, so I'm going for 2 brushfuls of the medium. That's the sort of thing we're looking to create here, so it's quite a weak version of that paint. And with that prepared, what you need to do is load up a small amount of it and then start painting it directly over these more intricate white details. So for example, these wings on the chest just here, so I'm going to paint it directly over so it runs into all of those recesses. Once the mix is dry, we then got our shading on these details, so now it's time to clean them up and highlight them. And we'll start by cleaning them up with some layering. For this, what I'm going to use is some ivory tusk, and then for the highlight, we'll need a pure white. I'm going to use some white star to do this. But first of all, we need that ivory tusk, and to apply it again, definitely stick to your small brush, because with this, we're looking to carefully apply this colour now only onto the flat areas of these details, whilst avoiding those recesses where we've now got that shading. So you will need lots of fine control here, and really take your time throughout, because these details, as you well know by now, are quite intricate. And the trick is to use the palette to make sure that paint is thinned and really smooth on your brush, and then importantly, just make sure there's not tons of it on there so that you have that accuracy, and then you're ready to move in and start layering these areas. So for example, the Dark Angel chapter badge just here, we want to first of all carefully pick out that sword, so just very gently moving down just to neaten that up by layering it onto these flat areas of that blade just there. And then as we get to the wings, we're looking for the flatter parts of them, so it's going to be a case of following each one of these lines very gently in areas like this along each one, just taking your time using the tip of the brush to make sure that we retain that shading. And then finally we need a pure white, so here I'm using some white star, and this is just going to be a highlight for these details, so just looking for the sharper parts that stand out and just gently want to pick those out. So for example, on that little cross guard I got on the sword symbol there, I just want to get those. And when it comes to the sword itself, I just want to get a highlight down the centre of that blade, so just very carefully applied along here and then around the outside edge, so this sort of region along here. And there we are, that white detail is complete as well, and Azrael is in fact very nearly finished at this stage. There's just a few things left to do, and one of those is quite an obvious one at this point. It's the blade of that sword, and so what we're going to do here is quite a special effect to make it stand out, as he's such a major character. What we need to do is start out by getting a nice sort of bluish green tone on the blade, and for this what I'm going to use is some Stegadon Scale Green. To apply it, I've got my size 1 brush, and with this we're looking to achieve as even and as smoother base coat as we can possibly get. So definitely make sure you thin that paint down the palette. Assume that you're going to have to apply it as 2 or 3 thin coats just to make sure you get that smoothness, but it's important for the following techniques that we're going to be using. Otherwise, if it's rough, that's really going to show up. So once you've got that paint thinned down, it's a matter of just applying it then onto the blade. And as I say, we want this to be as smooth as possible. So when applying it, try and put it on in smooth strokes, just working your way across the blades, just smoothly all the way down it, just gradually building it up, letting a coat dry, then going back in for another one. With that smooth base coat achieved, we can now move on to actually starting to create the effect on here. And to do this, what we're going to be doing is glazing some colours on there, gradually getting lighter and lighter to really build up the effect of almost like a shimmering blade. And to do this, first of all, what we need is some Thunderhawk Blue and also some Lamia Medium. And with this, what we're going to do is create this really thin glaze with the paint. So we need to do this on the palette first of all. Using my size 1 brush for this, I'm going to start out with just a little bit of Thunderhawk Blue there on the palette, and then we need some Lamia Medium. And we want to heavily dilute this, and it's going to result in us having to apply a lot of coats of this, and in fact the early coats is going to be like nothing's happening, but it's important that we do it gradually to slowly build up the gradient of colour that we're looking for. So you can see I'm just mixing this together, and I've created that highly diluted version of that paint, so it's super thin. You can always test on the palette, see just how thin it is, and ideally you want to barely be able to see it, but it is there. That looks pretty good to me, so I'm happy with that. Next trick is to make sure there's not tons of it on the brush, so just a small amount on there, and then we're ready to start applying it. And there's a particular motion for this to make it comfortable. We're aiming to get it lighter on the actual front of the cutting edge of the blade just there. So what we want to do is go in from this angle and just approach all the way down in one motion on that side of the blade, and as you get to about that point, just flick it off and just let it fade out there. Same on this side, where we want to go up in this direction, just gradually apply it all the way along and then lift off at about this point here. Now, if you got it right, it'll dry pretty quickly, and it's drying quite fast there, but whilst it just finishes off, we'll resume that on the other side. So again, just make sure there's not tons of paint on the brush. We're looking for it to be brighter on this side, so we want to come in at this angle, just go down there like that, and then lift away. And on the other side, we want to do the opposite thing. It's a bit more complex because of that energy node, so we just got to work around it. We'll probably have to go back over that a few times, but the important thing is when we get to the flat here, just go along and then lift away. So with that on there now, you can see it's dried on that side. Barely looks any different at all, but now we can go in for that second coat. So I'm going to go back in, same sort of mix on the paint, again looking to make sure we get the right side. So we're looking at this angle here, and we want to go down again, just applying it thinly on there and then lift away. Same on the other side. And basically you just got to keep on doing this until you get that Thunderhawk Blue becoming solid. Now each pass, just make sure you focus it less and less, so you're starting to build up more layers in smaller areas, and just keep on going until you get solid Thunderhawk Blue appearing about 2/3 of the way up. So this sort of region around there. And there we are, you can see those two colours are starting to cross over there, they're kind of meeting in the middle nicely, and so what we can do now is take it further. Now remember, throughout this process it can be a little bit organic, and you might need to adjust and go back to previous colours if you need to, and if you do, just thin them down just like we just done, using that Lamia Medium to turn them into a glaze, and just go back in the other direction, and this will help ease that gradient between the different colours. But once you've got the hang of it, it's quite straightforward to do it, and all we've got to do now is go lighter and lighter. So we're going to use some Fenrisian Grey now, again thin down with Lamia Medium, and then we'll move on to some Ulthuan Grey, again thin down with Lamia Medium. But first of all, we need that Fenrisian Grey and the Medium too, and I got them both just here, and what I'm using again is my size 1 brush for this. Just want to get it diluted just like we did in that previous stage. So again, using plenty of that medium to make sure it's really nicely thinned down, adding lots on there. So there we go, 2 brushfuls I think will do. We'll mix the paint in to create that really thin version of it. So we're looking for something kind of like that. Now again, just make sure there's not tons of it on your brush so that it doesn't start pooling or anything, and then we're ready to start applying it. And this time we're looking to go about halfway and, well, build it up from that point onwards. So if we start, for example, on the back of the blade just here, we want to go from about this point here and just bring it down thinly applied. So remember that first coat, it'll barely look like anything's happening, but the more coats you do, the stronger it's going to get. So just keep on going, building this up with those smooth motions, and keep on going until you've got a solid colour of this tone at about 1/3 on either side. So it's got to get stronger and stronger, again with that gradual gradient. Once that's done, we can then take it just a little bit further using some Ulthuan Grey. Again, thin down with Lamy Medium in the exact same way, and this time we just want to introduce it just towards either side of the blades. Just a little bit on that side and a little bit down here on both sides, and again just steadily build this up with a few coats until you get that solid colour right towards the very end. And with that, we now have the core effect of our energised power sword blade, and so now we can bring it together with some final highlights. And for this, what we're going to need is some Ulthuan Grey first of all, followed by some White Star. We're going to start out with that Ulthuan Grey, and here what we need to do is edge highlight it on the blade. So it's going to be the outside cutting edges and also that central ferrule that goes down the middle of it. So we want to make sure we pick all of this out, and this does need to be precise. So remember, it's all about getting the paint ready on the palette correctly. Just make sure you thin it down, but also don't overdo it so it's not too runny. And the real trick to make sure it doesn't go too runny is just to make sure you don't have loads of it on your brush. So use tissue as you need to, and the palette just to make sure it's not overloaded, and then we're ready to start applying it. So what we want to do on the outside cutting edge is always approach at about 45 degrees, and just using the side of the brush, just gently skim your way across the entire thing. So really gently like that to get that sharp line going all the way around. When it comes to the centre of the blade, you can do the same thing with the side of the brush, but you've got to be careful about how you're angling yourself. You've got to make sure you're basically flat against the overall shape of the sword, and just very, very gently start working your way down like this. Just gently skimming it just so you get that central line going all the way down the middle just here. Now, in addition, we've got these little nodes, which I did pick out with a little bit of Fenrisian Grey, but we just need to make sure they really pop out too. So again, just get a little bit of this colour, just apply it to these as well. And once that's done, we can then finish off with a fine highlight of a pure white. So here I'm using some White Star, and this is another edge highlight, but focused just at the very tip of the blade. So just skim it onto this part just at the very end, and just making sure you're nice and comfortable by angling the model as you need to. And we just want a very small amount down the very center as well. So just very gently in that sort of region there. Finally, on the nodes, we just need to pick out the round part of these too. So just add a little highlight onto these areas too. And once that's done, the power sword is then complete, and so we've just got a few little things left to do. The first of those is going to be the little plasma gun coils that are right there, and for this what we need to do is pick them out with a blue. So we're going to start out with some Thousand Suns blue. Then for the highlights we'll need some Araman blue followed by some Baharoth blue. But we're going to start out with Thousand Suns blue, and to apply this definitely go for your small brush because this detail is really small and quite tricky to get to, so it's going to really help picking this out. All you got to do is get this paint thinned down as ever on your palette so it's nice and smooth, and then it's time just to start blocking this detail in. And for this first stage, what we're looking at doing is the entire area. So all these coils, we just need to carefully apply the paint into this area, making sure it settles in the recessed parts in between it, but also picks out the raised up texture as well. So all the way around here. Once that's done, we're then ready for some Araman blue, and with this we need to layer it towards the middle of these coils. So I don't mean just the raised areas, though they do count, but what we need to do is just apply it into this sort of region here so that we're leaving Thousand Suns blue still showing on the outside where it meets that red. So we're looking at that area just there, then on the underside too, and the same on the other side. And then finally, we just need a little bit of Baharoth blue, and with this, we just need to pick out the raised detail of these coils. So just these lines that run along here, gently pick each one out. And there we are, the plasma's done, and so now we're going to move on to the final detail, which is to paint the eye lenses on his helmet. And to do this, what we need to do is start out with a base coat of a deep red. So we're going to use some corn red for this, and then we'll need a black wash over the top. Here I'm going to use some Oblivion black wash. But first of all, what we need is that corn red, and to apply it, again, stick to your small brush because now it is the eye, so we're going to need that control during this part. What we need to do is use the palette to help get that paint under control, just making sure it's nice and smooth. So add a little bit of water as you need to make sure it's got that nice consistency about it. And with that done, we can then paint this into the eyes. And rather than doing the entire area, what we're aiming to do is leave a little bit of black still showing on the outside. So what we want to do is just make sure you're nice and steady, gently approach it, and then fill in this area here so that you've got that nice red in the middle with a little bit of distinction on the outside edge. With the base coat done, you're now ready for some black wash. So here I'm using Oblivion black wash, and use your small brush again. You don't need very much of this either. What we want to do is just run it into the eye socket. So just let it settle in the recess so it's strong around the outside, but then just pull it towards the back of the eye so the colour is going to get darker in that rear area just there. The wash is dry, giving us that nice really dark red, so now it's time to highlight it to give this sort of gem-like impression for these lenses. And to do this, what we're going to need first of all is some Evilson Scarlet, followed by some orange flare, and then we'll need some white star. But first of all, we need Evilson Scarlet, and to apply it, go again for that really small brush, because this time we're going to be very selective as to exactly how much of this we're going to apply. Just make sure on your palette you get it nice and thin and relatively inky, so down to about this sort of point here, and then really importantly, just make sure there's not loads of it on your brush, because we mustn't let this go out of control. We just need to focus it just in particular parts. So with that prepared then, just make sure you've got that good point on your brush, and then brace your hands so you're really steady. And with this, we're aiming to essentially paint a little line towards the front of the eye lens. So we're looking at this region right here. We just want to gently go in and just introduce it at that part right there, and then stop there. So it's going to be a brighter red at the front, and then get darker towards the back of that lens. Once that's done, we're then ready for some orange flare, and with this we're going to be applying it in the same sort of area, but just a little bit more focused towards the very front of each lens. Just a very small amount in this region right here. And then finally, to complete the effect, we just need a little bit of white star, and this is just a dot at the back of each eye lens. So just very gently introduced right there, and there we go. Now with this done, you're then ready to make the final assembly of Azrael, sticking the model together with little bits of super glue, and then you're ready to base the miniature. As ever, it's entirely up to you how you base it, but in this case, I'm going to go for a desert base. And here we have the completed Supreme Grand Master Azrael ready to lead the Dark Angels to victory. So in this video, as you've seen, we went a little bit further than we normally do. We're doing a lot of manual shading, lots of blending as well, and some really interesting techniques. And if this tickled your fancy, I definitely encourage you to give it a go, because it's actually a lot easier to do than you might first think. And if you have a go at doing this and you enjoy it, you'll find suddenly lots of doors open to you for all sorts of interesting effects and techniques. Now, you don't necessarily have to do this with Azrael, but any miniature that's got robes on, or even a Dark Angel Sergeant, something like that, would be perfect for this sort of thing. So anyway, we hope you enjoy painting your miniature, and we'll see you again very soon.